So welcome everyone. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes. We'll just give some time for people to join. Um, just to let you know, you should have a Q&A function somewhere down at the bottom of your screen. We should have some time for questions at the end. We've got two very exciting and informative presentations. So please think of questions as you're listening and send us your questions that we can discuss at the end. Okay, we've got quite a few people have joined. I think some people are still joining, but I think we can make a start. So my name is Ahmed Beltagi. I'm a member of the Advanced Services Group and an associate professor here at Aston Business School. And it's a great pleasure today to introduce and to hear from Mark Martin and Mark Preedy. So both of them have a wealth of experience in services and will help us learn about today's topic, which is really around leadership, capability and execution. So understanding how you actually achieve as a service and achieve success through it. Um, a little bit of background, but I'm sure both speakers will tell you a lot more about their backgrounds. So Mark Martin has worked in medical technology, and he was the sales and marketing director at Karl Storz UK. Um, he worked there introducing services, changing the culture around services, and helping to grow services and to grow the business through services. So lots of really valuable um, experiences around leadership there. And Mark Preedy in a completely different sector has many years as a manager and director of Goodyear and worked in the road transport sector. He'll be telling us a bit about some of his experiences about similarly leading servitization initiatives, some of the challenges and maybe how to overcome them. So we have experience from these two very different sectors. Um, both both marks are now kind of going beyond the companies that they'll be telling us about, but lots of interesting background to share there. So the what we'll be talking about today, I'm going to just give you a brief recap of what you hopefully have seen from some of the previous webinars, which is around the evidence that advanced services and servitization are positive for revenue, for profit, for productivity. Then we'll be hearing from Mark Martin about what it takes to achieve some of these things, and from Mark Preedy telling us about scale and overcoming some of those challenges. Um, Lots and lots to share, but both speakers have only a short time, so please pick their brains and ask questions. Just to reiterate, at the bottom of your screen, you should have a Q&A function. So please start putting your questions in there that we should have some time to cover at the end. For those who are not so familiar with us, I'd like to introduce you to the Advanced Services Group. So, as it says on the screen, we are very much industry focused, but we're also led by research. We're at the cutting edge of research in services and servitization. And we work across the academic and practitioner landscapes. We have worked with a very large number of companies over many years, from multinational and large companies such as the ones that our speakers today will be talking about, to very small companies, largely in the West Midlands region where Aston University is based. We have a partnership where we take executives from large businesses and support them on their servitization journey. And we have lots of research that not only has academic impact, but is based on the real world and contributes to the real world. And that includes what I'll be sharing with you in a moment. So I've already briefly introduced us. I'm Ahmed, and it's easy to know who the other speakers are. They're both Mark. Mark Martin, who will be telling us about his experiences from Karl Storz, and Mark Preedy, who will tell us about some of his experiences at Goodyear. The question we're looking at, so firstly, an assumption that as a service business models, what we would call advanced service business models, um, will drive success in businesses. And I'll, again, if you're not convinced by that, I'll touch on that in a moment. But um, assuming you're here because you do think that as a service works, what is it that separates the winners from losers? Why do some firms win and some don't? And the thing we'll focus on particularly is leadership and hear about how that works. Um, if you haven't done so already, I'd like to draw your attention to the big business case for servitization. So this is a study recently completed that was led by Aston Business School, by the Advanced Services Group, with collaboration from Warwick, from Lancaster. Um, and this is funded by the UK government, looking at really finding the evidence relating servitization with productivity, sustainability, business growth. So I'd encourage you to download and read that report if you haven't done so already. But a brief summary of that. Um, we covered in a survey around 700 firms, covering all different types of services and sectors and so on. And then focusing in more depth on about half of those 378 firms where there's data available for their performance over a number of different years. And from that, we can extract the connections among the different factors we're interested in. To validate that and to add some further depth to that, there's a number of 70 firms that attended a series of events, and from those there's more in-depth qualitative data and some case studies to support to try and explain what goes on in the data. What one piece of background, I'm assuming that everyone here has some ideas about servitization. If you don't, then you know where to find information from the Advanced Services Group's website. But essentially, it's important to understand that services are not all the same. There are different levels of service. So base services focused on supporting products, intermediate services largely supporting getting outputs from products and improving the products and getting more performance from products, and advanced services, which are really supporting the customer, using the product as a platform to get value for the customer, to create outcomes for the customer. Where that's relevant, the data from the survey tells us that the firms that have a larger share of their revenues coming from services tend to have larger revenue overall. And you can see there, for every 1% increase in the proportion of services, there's a disproportionately larger increase in revenue. So the more services the more success you have with services, the more success overall. And the same applies for profits. The more increase you have in services, the bigger the impact that has on profits. So it makes sense to focus your efforts on services and do all the things that you need to improve those services. Building on what I just said about the difference between advanced services and other types of services, that's where we really see the impact. That for every 1% increase from advanced services, you get this huge 7.8% increase in profits. So, of course, these are averages over that large sample, but given the amount of analysis and the amount of data that we have, this tells you that something's going on there. Um, so this is what you hopefully have seen from previous webinars, and you'll see in the report. The question we want to ask about today is really how to make sure we achieve this, and what is it that helps you get this success. So from that analysis, a few things that really stand out. One is about leadership. And leadership there is really having a culture that is built around customer centricity, around focusing on the customer, not focusing on the product, seeing the product as something that helps the customer. Another one is putting more effort into customer relationships. The firms that valued customer relationships more and see those as more important, we can see higher productivity in those firms. Related to that, we've got um, anything that helps you to build those customer relationships and get new customers. Um, that's obviously contributing there. And digital technology and ecosystems is something that is not on its own what's leading, but we see it as, and the evidence we have from the data suggests that the digital technology is helping to understand customers, to build that customer relationship better. So from the evidence we have in the report, what I would certainly take from it is that leading a service culture and a focus on customers and using all the resources available to have deeper relationships with customers is what can make advanced services work and help you to succeed through as a service. That's the academic side. What we really want to hear about today, and where I hope you'll have lots of questions to ask from our speakers. I'm going to hand over to Mark Martin first to tell us about how to actually do this. So, Mark, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you, Ahmed. So, firstly, thank you very much for allowing me to present today. I'm sure some of you are all thinking, what on earth is a sales and marketing director doing talking about service? And that just sort of typifies the situation of where service needs to sit. It's not just a service that involves service managers and service directors. It's something that should be embraced by the whole senior leadership of a company to add growth to that company. So, interestingly, from my own perspective, there should be more sales and marketing people involved in service because as a collaboration, which is what I'll come on to talk about in a minute. So, firstly, thank you very much. Secondly, also just to explain, Karl Storz is what we call a surgical instrument company, manufactures surgical instruments in Germany, sold globally. And obviously, I was looking after the UK side of the business, but primarily, as you can appreciate, surgical instruments play a very pivotal and important part within healthcare, and so in terms of looking after those equipment, which is highly technical, they're going inside a patient. Last thing you want to do is for something to happen inside that patient. So there's a lot of regulation and there's a lot of support and a lot of issues around quality of instrumentation, which is really important to take into consideration. So without further ado, I'll move on with my first slide. I think I have control. Yeah, there we go. Um, so what I want to just cover off on this first slide is and I apologize if I'm teaching you the obvious, is that everybody has different perception of service. What is service? Service to people could be servicing a car, it could be servicing in a service in a restaurant, waiting staff, or it could be service that the chef provides, providing online service support with our phones and our apps. And in my case, it was supporting medical products for improving patient outcomes. So service has so many different permutations and understandings by different people. And I think this is something that we can all work on in terms of each understanding what service means. We often see products that have warranties. There's a misconception around warranties. Is that a service? No, it's not. It's just usually against a manufacturing issue. So understanding what service is really important. And the reason why I mention this is because I come back to my um, sorry, I don't know what's happened to my presentation there. But the reason why I come back to this is because I'll call it misalignment. And there was a misalignment between Karl Storz in our headquarters with Germany, because they had a very different understanding of what service was that they were offering compared to what we wanted to deliver in the UK to our customers. And so this was we had to understand what their challenges were and what they believe service was, to enable us to address them, and address their concerns, and then be able to enable us to move forward in service as a growth opportunity. So addressing those issues was especially important, particularly because we were going to ask our customers who traditionally would buy something and break it and we would repair it. We were going to be asking them to please don't buy it and please don't break it. And that is the basic principles of what we call pay by outcome service delivery, and transferring the risk of that product moving from the customer to the provider. So I'll just reiterate there. So we were going from a please buy it and break it so we can repair it, to a please don't buy it and don't break it, because that's the kind of service that we were trying to offer, all encompassing. So as you can imagine, the principle of that required some understanding by senior leadership. So why did we introduce and expand service delivery? It wasn't just because we had to, otherwise we would lose out on tenders, or be reactive to demands of the market. It was in simple terms because we saw um, the long-term sustainable business growth opportunity, and we recognize that our customers needed help so they can focus on their own priorities. As we know, the NHS isn't exactly full of cash to spend on lots of things. They had a finite amount of money, a finite amount of products, but they had an increasing number of patients that needed treating. So we had to find solutions that were going to help them treat those patients whilst maintaining the same amount of equipment that was needed. So things like offering service was that way to meet their needs. So to summarize on that first part, Karl Storz, we were clear on why service mattered. We were supporting outcomes, not just the equipment. But the real challenge wasn't defining what we wanted to do, that was clear. It was turning the intent of into day-to-day decisions, priorities, results, and behaviors across the organization. And in other words, moving that intent to impact. So if we're moving on to the next slide, yeah, good. Oh, no, gone too far. Christina, that's it. Brilliant. Thank you. So moving on to this slide. So why don't services take hold within organizations? Um, Interestingly, and I've put some comments here around the good intentions, we want to offer service, but actually there are some structural blockers that are preventing us, and they could be a number of things. Now, in Carl Storts, we were very much wedded before prior to me taking on the leadership role, we were very much wedded to service being positioned as an add-on and not as a value add. Okay, as an add-on rather than a value add. We had sales activities, incentives, and leadership attention remained firmly product centric, rather than seeing a broader outlook and looking at customer solutions with focus. And without the leader ownership and understanding, service simply just went through the motions, and it delivered the minimal return. So what we wanted, or we saw as a vision, was to see actually service can influence long-term sustainable value, and therefore it can also improve and benefit the sale of products as well thereafter. So again, within Carl Storts UK, service was a separate department, technical in nature, and was a support function for the sales as the main breadwinner. Service needed to be seen as an equally important as sales, arguably even more important to maintain the long-term customer engagement and business, which is what we've alluded to previously. So this was a change we had to make. The collaboration of sales and service with linked incentives to drive the right behaviors to achieve long-term business was really important. And the reason why it was important was because one of my previous colleagues used to say, sales get them, service keeps them. And how right he was, and he is, with that one. Sales will only get you so far. Service will take you the other way, part of the journey, and continue into the future. So we, like many other companies, would still have things like products, commercial offers, and that was geared towards shifting more boxes or re-energizing an existing product. We put special offers in, but in actual fact, what we needed to focus on was the serviceability and of those existing products, and locking customers into 2 or 5 or even 10 years of service support, because that guaranteed consistent and predictable business, as well as locking out the competitors long term. So to do that, that was through collaboration between sales and service within the senior leadership. And lastly, sort of come back to my previous point, where the commercial offers are focused on selling individual products. These were quick wins, and what our customers wanted was solutions to their problems, not just to buy a box, deliver it, and off we go. They wanted solutions in the NHS to make their life easier, and that's where outcome-based solutions were enabled. And that meant that they could focus on their roles without worrying about equipment downtime or budget restrictions. That was all looked after using outcome-based solutions that we would provide. So on to the next slide. Okay, so we needed to have a shift in leadership in terms of our outlook and what we perceived as important. And I've labeled these into three things: strategy, responsibility, and financial. Leadership had to understand and embrace the strategy to move away from box shifting to solution selling to meet the customer's needs. The customer may not have always known exactly what they wanted from us, but talking solutions, just not just products, helped cut through some of the uncertainty that they had. So we took this outcomes-based route. That route then had to be embraced, understood, owned, and supported, not just by the service manager or the service director, but by the whole senior leadership team. And if the sales and service teams see senior leadership working together as a team, then it has a positive cultural impact on their teams. And they too develop a more inclusive collaboration. And that might mean things like working together on joint meetings, joint customer visits, internally with joint meetings and kickoff meetings, regional service and sales team meetings, and a lot of information sharing between service and sales. Internally, we had responsibilities to develop things like processes, KPIs, incentives, financial modeling, and reporting to support the long-term value proposition that we were giving our customers and the long-term strategy that we recognized as the way forward for our company. We also developed things like revenue recognition targets, not just sales achievements. So we were incentivizing both sales and service to work together to create a service orientated environment that provides long-term business. Externally, with our customers, we were then able to show customers the support sales and service combined offers. More people in front of the customers as teams, not as individuals. And we sold long-term partnerships with customers where they saw value and ownership in our offering, not just a product in a box that is delivered and left once it's been sold. So long-term, it offered customers assurance, consistency, and exceptional customer service. Consequently, after launching our combined sales and service strategy, over 40% of our monthly turnover came from guaranteed service delivery. To note, that wasn't at the detriment of sales either. That was combined sales and service growth through delivering monthly service. And it didn't happen overnight. Much as I would love to have seen that happen overnight, it really didn't. But it was a gradual growth year on year. And what that does is that takes the lumps and the bumps out of business and makes it predictable, knowing that 40% of your business is coming through service delivery month on month, enables you to then focus on other activities. So the benefits of service, not only to the customer, but to the business as a whole, was strong. And it was music to the leadership's ears, and especially the finance director's ears. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll quickly whiz through. So executing this in the real world, service delivery is certainly not linear. It rarely, and those of you in service will know, it never follows a straight path. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, and I'm not going to lie, it was sometimes messy, because there was no template. We were pioneers, certainly in the medical technology arena. We were pioneers of service delivery in its full extent, and we took some wrong turns along the route and met some internal and external obstacles. Equally, not everything landed first time. There was a resistance, especially when services challenged the established roles of revenue or revenue assumptions, when we challenged the existing roles of product sales. But what mattered was we were persistent, we were committed and believed in what we were doing, continuously learning and adapting and accepting that services mature and grow through use along with sales. And ultimately, as we saw in our turnover, that actually sales growth benefited from service delivery as well. So they then complemented each other. So a critical point for the senior leadership when we were doing this was understanding that not every service contract delivered consistent profit. That was our risk of service delivery, and I could go into that in more detail at some point. But what we did was minimize those risks, and where possible, we would provide things like training, regular reporting, regular feedback in terms of the data that we were getting about the performance of our products. So we could try and minimize those risks. So we would have things like training, on-site support, regular reviews of product history and product performance to ensure we minimize the risks associated with the profitability of the service that we're offering. But what was clear was that successful contracts far outweighed those that weren't successful, and therefore offset against a small minority of negative contracts. Now, that's not great for financial management. However, importantly, we looked at the overall, not just the individual service performance, but we looked at the overall service performance, looking at the bigger picture. And by using that data, we knew full well that overall our service delivery was exceptionally profitable as a whole. So moving on to my last slide, the insight that matters most, to sort of conclude this, service design isn't really an issue. You can design all kinds of different services, but what you need to have is things like good historical data, an understanding of your products, and experience of what your customer needs long term to be able to provide the right service. The second point is leadership mindset sets the ceiling. Leadership must demonstrate they understand the benefits of service delivery, embracing it, and are committed to working collectively to achieve the goal, not just the service director or the service team, because the leadership will set the ceiling of progress of service and company turnover based on service delivery. And then lastly, how value is run determines what scales. The value we and our customers put on service dictated how we wanted to take service delivery. So selling and offering high value services creates yet more value by the products that we were able to additionally sell. And as I would always say, never undersell service. So my key takeaway for Carl Storz was the fact that the failure rarely came from poor service design. It comes from leaders running a service business with a product mindset. And when leaders think beyond products and think servicing, the execution and the scale of service delivery becomes possible. Okay, so there we have it. That's a bit of insight from me for Carl Storz.
Thank you very much. I think if you move forward one more, you've got a,
Oh
there we
yeah,
go.
there we go.
Thanks a lot for that.
Brilliant.
So if we just take a moment to reflect on that and to think about that while Mark Preedy gets ready to share his insights. Again, please make sure that you're adding to the question and answer. We have a short poll for you, just reflecting on what you've heard. The question is, where is your organization today in delivering as a service? Exploring services exist but are not core. You are currently scaling service-led models, or you are already at the stage of advanced or outcome-based, which is where we're all trying to get to. I'm not allowed to vote on this, but we're interested to know where the audience see their organisations. So give you another minute or so. And there we go. So almost half exploring services, and no one feels confident enough to say that they are already delivering advanced services. So I think that tells us that we're all on this journey. We've all got some way to go. And I think with that in mind, if I can now ask Mark Preedy to share some insights and help us think about what we should be doing to move along on that journey.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ahmed, and thank you for the invite. As that slide builds in front of you there, I worked for large American corporations for the last 33 years of my career. So I did 16 years with General Electric and their transportation businesses and asset businesses. Then I moved to Goodyear 17 years ago. Again, looking at service-led models, looking at businesses that require services and the traditional sense of the services, which was a man in a van. Um, but again, as we move through this, I'll talk a little bit around some of the things that we saw, some of the things that we found, and how we had to use a huge amount of change management to get people through this journey of only selling a product, but also selling an outcome. So again, as you guys would know, Goodyear is a large product-based uh, historical business, um, and it faced huge pressure led by prices of new competitors. Most of those competitors came from um, Southeast Asia, and they didn't carry the huge R&D programs and budgets that people like Goodyear and people like Michelin did. So therefore, you had a product at a much less capability at that point in time. So that premium product that Goodyear produced, we needed to somehow elevate this and make this project, the product differentiate the stuff that was out there. Um, and of course, the differential in price point between those two was significant, upwards of 50 to 60% between some of the new entrants into the market and some of the ones that were well established. Again, the traditional ones like Michelin, Bridgestone, Continental, and Goodyear. Um, so that differentiation needed to happen. Um, Again, if you think about sort of Asian production, those guys also benefited from less price pressure on, less cost pressure on inflation. And also their non-European manufacturing footprint gave them a very good and very successful competitive product cost advantage. So Goodyear had to compete with that and find a way of being able to extend the life of that asset and extend the value of that asset through other ways. So we looked into the services space and looked at the way that cars were evolving at that point in time was a big thing. You know, cars around 10 or 11 years ago when Goodyear embarked on this journey were starting to come with legislation-led TPMS. You know, driver would get an advanced warning when you were driving along in your car. It would say you needed pressure, you needed to check your pressure, etc. So we started looking in the space of, you know, how could we connect that vehicle to the cab? How could we connect the tire, because the tire is mobile, to have some kind of predictive algorithms that allowed the end user to know whether or not that tire was gonna have an issue. Um, at that moment in time, we had some fairly primitive subscription type models, which was a price per kilometer. So, in other words, you know, Goodyear would take the risk on that product, and we would find ourselves in a position then where we could potentially overfit because the way the tire was maintained when it was through the life cycle of its life wasn't always made to the optimum value of the product. So we looked at different places to play. Um, we took a stance to focus on large fleets, and the reason we did that was because we knew that they would have an absolute need to look at fuel consumption, fuel control, and uptime. So again, if you think in the UK, people like DPD, people like Tesco's, People have got on-time delivery obligations, and why having a vehicle parked at the side of the road with a tire-related issue would then impact the end user. If you think of ordering a mobile phone through Vodafone that's delivered by DPD, you take an hour to wait for that window for your parcel to be dropped off at your house. So if you've taken that time out to do that, DPD's defaults for making sure tires are delivered on full, that started to play a game. So we embarked on this journey. I say we, I've recently left Goodyear, but when I was with Goodyear, we embarked on this around 2015, 2016. On one of the big breakthroughs with some work we did with Morrison's, the supermarket, where we incubated what we called then a drive over reader, which is essentially a huge glass plate that we inserted into the ground, where a driver could drive over that plate before it left the yard. It would light up as green if all the tyres were pressure, tread depth, and defect free. It could drive to the right for green. If it flashed up that something was wrong with the asset, we would put it into a lane where we could then go and have mobile service technicians work on it. Goodyear in the UK has 250 mobile service vans that allow us to deploy those services, very much product driven and stress free. So as I move on to the next slide, some of the steps we took along the way, and Mark talked about this in his few slides before, having that senior lead team investment, not only in money, but in mind, so trying to convince a traditional product led business that, okay, that's not going to get us to the promised land anymore. We're going to have to spend money on top of R&D for product and look at the service space, was something that took some time. Goodyear, very traditional, very American, very much set in its ways. We were able to convince the senior lead team over a number of months and years that this was the way to go, and how much money we needed to almost start a startup for that. We invested in a whole new group of people to do that for us. So we went out to the marketplace and found experts in tech, found experts in automotive tech to allow us to develop things that the Goodyear family at that point in time, we didn't have those within our teams. We were traditional product-based people, so having somebody different with a different mindset, with a different approach, was the way we had to go. And that led me onto the training piece, as you see there next. What I would say is, statistically, I think 40% of the sales force we had at the beginning of this journey didn't work for Goodyear after the incubation period. So 4 out of 10 guys didn't make it through the product selling to outcome selling solutions. They just weren't able to mentally comprehend what we were trying to do. Trying to sell an outcome to an end user is very, very difficult to selling a product, and trying to make sure that you can prove the steps along the way of how that asset lasts. Proved too much for some people. And we were very prepared for the churn. We had a very honest conversation as a group of sales leaders as to how we believed that would go. And I put a 50% ratio in turnover, and it was only 40. So we fully expected to lose every other person because we were making that migration and making that change. Still, after I left, Goodyear put people through training every quarter on solutions. We have an internal system that refreshes, that allows us to track who's done all of the refresher training. Because again, I'll allude to this a little bit later. The product life cycle takes 3 to 5 years in R&D. The tech life cycle takes 3 to 5 months in some cases. So that mindset change between R&D and how we can move that along is very, very different. The proof of concept to the end user was a big deal as well, not only to convince them to buy a solution on top of a tire, but also how we proved to them that this worked. So we went through a whole incarnation of a thing called benefits realization. So we would sit with a customer at the beginning of a contract and benchmark what we believe the outcome could be from selling the solution. So we would have a baseline measurement taken of their fleet size, the tread depths on the rubber that was on the fleet. We would look at their fuel consumption. We would look at their routes. We would look at whether they're traditional over-the-road fleet or one that did thousands of miles across Europe, and try to understand how that would then feed the algorithm to work on the pressure monitoring systems. So then we had to prove that we'd reduced breakdowns, we'd reduced fitments, we'd reduced costs, maximized uptime, And ultimately there, the upselling additional pricing that we got, not for the product, but for the service selling, we could then prove that that was mutually beneficial for both businesses because they would see a reduction in downtime and really see a benefit in their own P&L, as well as Goodyear's who were taking the risk on those subscription-led models. This thing stands or falls by your network. So it's a bit like the McDonald's effect. You want to go in and have the same thing delivered every time. So in the UK, it was fairly easy because we had 250 vans, as I said before. But the further we went east and the further the business model changed, those guys wanted a margin on service as well as wanting a margin on tyre. So having to work with the independent service network that Goodyear employs as we go through Europe was a very different mindset and concept to the way we managed it in the UK. So again, we had to really consider how much was, a fair price for these services, and the fact that they would lose margin because they were fitting less tyres. We had to bridge that gap in the dealer revenue to make sure that again we had a consistent model for some of the pan-European customers that we make the promise to. That proved very, very difficult over time. And ultimately, what we saw is, without quoting Goodyear's figures, because it's wrong for me to do, but you can find them; they're publicly available. The service revenue grew incrementally, to the point now where when I look at what was behind when I left, sorry, recently, there's 250,000 vehicles on subscription models with Goodyear now. From nothing 10 years ago to 250,000 vehicles that you see on the road driving around with Goodyear solutions, and that internal promise we made to deliver on the investment that the corporation made resulted last year in a new business model launch, which was Tyres as a Service. That uses some very specific technology, a halo on the side of a wheel. So, that's another new invention and route into the service space that Goodyear has done. And that wouldn't be possible without having proven the success over times and how that's then manifested itself in Goodyear's P&L. And ultimately, the multiples of a service-led business are much higher, talking 11 and 12 multiples compared to a traditional product-based business, which is traditionally only 3 or 4. So it adds value to the entire way that businesses are viewed. And just a reflection as I look at my last slide here, what took time and what was really difficult. That understanding of the network, it takes time, and having that uniform approach. So, you don't turn the lights on a Monday and expect by Friday that the thing works correctly. It takes time. You have to have your network established. You have to be ready to go to market across ready to go to market across multiple geographies, ready with that understanding. And that piece on that end-to-end justification of the return on investment is a big deal. And again, that sales capability and mindset change, it took the longest. Even after I'd left, and as I was approaching leaving, we've introduced, a different way that Goodyear will operate. Again, that mindset change and that sales capability and sales enablement has to work hand in glove with any strategy change. And the strategy change in selling the service and the outcome was bigger than anything that I'd really encountered in my time at Goodyear over the 17 years that I was there. Some things that proved really difficult was that whole piece around managing that internal expectation. Okay, so, large global American corporations, they want to see a return on the investment by Friday. It takes time. Those service revenue streams take time to establish. And we had to introduce something at that point in time was brand new to what we did. Never been seen before, never been used before. So we very much led the industry in the way that was going, so much so that now pretty much everybody has an offering. Sort of shedding that historical shackle of being a traditional product-only manufacturer, okay? Goodyear is still viewed in many ways as one of the globe's leading tyre manufacturers with industry-leading, market-leading, award-winning products, which is super cool. But it's still viewed in that context still by many, many people. So even though we have 250,000 operators working with these solutions, it's still almost like a secret. And again, the more we expand that, the more we talk about that, the more we have a chance to be able to grow that. And the last thing I will put there is, and it's my last comment, is the speed of tech. That took us a little bit by surprise because we weren't experienced in that. So if you want to tell me about building a new tyre, I'm going to tell you it takes between 3 and 5 years. I'll make something fantastic on fuel efficiency, rolling resistance, winter legislation. I can do those things all day long. And I know that it's going to take me 3 to 5 years to build the next best Goodyear tyre. However, you talk about 3G, 4G, 5G, the speed at which these things move took us by surprise. And balancing that cash flow and inventory and technological advances with the customer base, that took us quite a while to understand the cadence of that and how that could change. So that's a warning that we never saw, and that's probably taken the most amount of time for us to bed in and consider. But ultimately, big success for Goodyear. We started our work with the group in Aston over 10 years ago. And I think from little seeds grew sort of big trees, and Goodyear is justifiably very proud of their service-led businesses now. And those services are deployed in over 40 countries at different levels of success. So 250,000 vehicles over 40 plus countries. So we kind of created music for the masses, but now it's about refinement and growing that to protect Goodyear in a rapidly changing product environment. And that's me. Thank you very much for the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So we have questions flooding in now. So Mark, Preedy, if I let you catch your breath for a moment. Um, Mark Martin, the first question we got there, in fact, both of you
Mm,
mentioned that leadership is critical, and you talked about mindset change and so on.
mm,
I think I can agree with the question there that these are not the typical leaders most current companies have in place. How do we
mm.
develop these leaders?
Yeah, it's I'm not entirely sure that it's true that we don't have the right leaders. I think it's more about educating the leadership and getting them to understand more about what service can benefit, how service can benefit the business as a whole. Because I think if I was, if as a leader, if somebody came to me and said, I can increase your profitability and I can increase your turnover by doing X, Y, and Z, I would be interested. And then to want to know more about it, to understand it, say, well, if that's going to help my business, then I'm interested. So I think it's not so much identifying new leaders or develop it's actually giving them the
Mhm.
facts around what service can deliver to a business as well as the customer.
Okay. Um, Mark Preedy, would you add anything to that, or what's your take on the question of do we have the right leaders in place and how do we develop them?
I think Goodyear hired a new team, so we knew right at the outset that we didn't have that capability and skill set to do it. So by bringing in a dedicated leader of that side of the business to work alongside the traditional salespeople like me, we were able to cross-functionally work together and find a way. Because we had guys going out to fleets that could lead the way with product, but we didn't have industry experts in terms of the service things that we wanted to sell. So we ended up putting people together. And over the years, by definition, that succession planning leadership
Mm.
line, they gathered pace because they associated the fact that you got a product with a service. They did too. So that forced Goodyear to look at their people in a different way as well. So we bought the pipeline in, then grew our own. So we did it two ways.
Um, I- Another question for both of you, but maybe Mark Preedy, you've got the mic. So someone is asking, we're currently struggling to define what outcome is. Um, how did you define an outcome that serves as an average of your customers and avoids having to have something customized and tailor-made for each customer?
Yeah, so it's a great question. What we did is I alluded to it when I was talking through there. We looked at, because tires are an asset and they're stuck on a vehicle. So if that vehicle doesn't work, then there's a tangible deficit for downtime. So we looked, because we were controlling the breakdowns through all of the different algorithms, we were absolutely able to pinpoint how many breakdowns per customer, the average. We looked at their application, the type of roads they were driving on, to see if that had an impact. So we were able to pull all that information together and work out average miles per gallon, what that impact was on fuel, and what that impact was on time with breakdowns, because each of those breakdowns had a cost and a cost related to it. So we ended up with three or four um, very, very static almost KPIs that every customer wanted. Um, my last comment there, it got quite complicated when you were at miles per gallon. That was one of the big challenges because, again, you could have a really big driver, you could have bad weather, you could have bad traffic. So, what we had to do with that, we had to collect tons and tons and tons of data and put that into algorithms to help us predict what that looked like. And then we could also set a prediction on top, not just what had happened. So that's kind of how we got to that point, Alan.
You, Martin, the same question, how did you define outcomes? But I think there's also a question asking, could you give us an example from Karl Storz? So maybe you can tackle both questions together.
Gosh, yeah. So in terms of outcomes, it was actually no. I'll answer the first one because then that relates to the outcome. So to give you some examples, yeah, obviously the presentation brief was around about the leadership side of things, less so about using examples, but ultimately, what we would do in Karl Storz, what we were doing in Karl Storz is having you had traditional service contracts, so you'd have a product and then you'd support that product if it broke. But then we moved it up on the stepping stones to look at things like what we would do as managed service deliveries. So we would not we would actually own the equipment that the hospital is going to use first of all, and once we'd understood what they wanted, so we would own it and rent it or lease it to them based on usage. We would also have what we call an on-site person there, so somebody that was trained by Karl Storz, that would sit within the operating theatres and look after that equipment. And that's when we talk about transferring risk. If the customer owns the product, the risk of it breaking is their responsibility. If we own the product and we're just renting it out and leasing it to the customer, then it's our responsibility to make sure that it's working. So that's where your outcomes, if we don't perform and our outcome, and there's a problem with that equipment, downtime, etc., then that's our problem and we've got to solve that. So what we're offering is an outcome-based solution where we provide the product, it works every time, on time, whenever it should do. And if we don't deliver that, then that's our risk and we need to mitigate it by doing whatever that might be, training, having somebody there. Does that explain, Steve, what we were doing?
Well, Steve, I think feel free to contact Mark later. I think what you
Yeah,
described there, I've
indeed.
had the pleasure of seeing a bit more of that myself, and it's a very interesting model about how you work with the customers
Mm.
and so on. Unfortunately, although we've got more questions and it's all very, very exciting, but I'll have to call us to a close. So thank you very much to both of
Oh,
our speakers. We just want to kind of remind you of where to hear more stories like these and a bit more support for helping you to make these journeys. Um, so we have a number of books and reports and other material available and case studies. Please do make use of the resources on our website and keep in touch. I think, um, yep, the next step, if you've been affected by any of the subjects discussed today, please do get in touch with on the website or in particular my colleague Alistair. His email address is down at the bottom there. He can talk with you, understand what your position is, what your needs are, and draw on the expertise that we have within the Advanced Services Group to help you along on this journey. Um, Yep. So let's continue the conversation. I can see in the chat there's conversations with the speakers happening. Please feel free to continue with that. If you're not already following us on LinkedIn and so on, or if you're not on the mailing list, then please do get in touch. Thanks for the reminder. We have next week the Spring Servitization Conference, which I'm sure you're all welcome to attend if you want to read more about that. And if we don't see you there, we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar or event. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Sorry if we didn't manage to get to your questions. Have a great rest of your day.